All right, structure of a nerve. We remember back to the muscles and back to the bones. We remember that there is a connective tissue covering over top of each one of those, such as the periosteum, which was over top the bones, and over the muscles we had the epimysium, we had perimysium, and endomysium. While here over top of the nerve we've got actual myelination and these connective tissues that are going to cover over top of our myelinated fibers. A nerve is nothing more than a cord-like extension of the PNS. We have nerves running all throughout our body, and what they do is they send and receive signals. They are myelinated axons that are bundled together, and they are going to help protect your body by sending signals, relaying information, or allowing for connection points between parts in your body. Looking at our connective tissue coverings, they're going to be looking very similar to what you saw in the muscle section. Over the entire group of the nerve, all the axons bundled together, you're going to find what's called the epineurium, the outside, the epi. Over a bundle or a fascicle of these axons, we're going to find a perineurium, just like over a fascicle of muscle fibers we found perimysium. Then individually encasing each axon in their myelin sheaths, we have the endoneurium. Here's a beautiful picture from your text as to what it looks like. We have the entire structure of the nerve is the epineurium. Then if we look at just a fascicle, we're going to find that this is a perineurium. And then individually we have these tiny little axons inside here. These are your endoneurium. And then if you'll notice there's a blood vessel right in the middle. Of course they are highly active and they take a lot of energy, so we need to be pumping tons of nutrients, oxygen, and other types of power into each one of these nerves. Here's a beautiful picture, and this is a picture that a lot of times you'll see on a text exam. So get to know this a little bit more clearly. Again, outside the entire structure is your epineurium. Here's a fascicle that's bundled up by a perineurium, and then one individual axon has the endoneurium. Again, looks very similar to what our muscle fibers would have looked like, but this time, of course, we're in nerves. So how do we classify nerves? Most of these nerves are going to be mixtures of somatic and autonomic fibers, and what we're going to do is we're going to be able to send and receive signals. They have sensory information that goes through them. They have motor information that goes through them, and that just tells us that we have two-way transmission of these nerves. But the two major types, of course, are afferent and efferent, sensory or motor. And if they're sensory, of course, their impulses go towards the brain. And if they're motor, their impulses go away from the brain. Sometimes you'll see it written as away from the CNS or towards the CNS, and that's fine. Either way is fine. Some nerves that we're going to find are purely sensory. Some nerves are purely motor. However, most of the time, what you're going to find is that these motor and sensory nerves are going to be mixed, and that's because they have the ability to send and receive signals, and they're able to communicate effectively with different parts of the body. There are, however, these areas in the body that have just somatic or just visceral. Remember, somatic mostly is meaning going to voluntary versus visceral is going to involuntary structures. And of course, the way that we classify them is by putting them either into cranial or spinal nerves. Now, we do have a lab coming up that's going to be talking about your cranial nerves, so we don't spend a whole lot of time on the spinal nerves, so I'll show you a few more pieces of information about them. One thing I would like to talk about is we've mentioned before that neurons are amitotic, meaning that they do not reproduce after birth. We don't create new ones, so if you kill off a neuron, then they're done. However, one thing I do want to share is that the axon portion actually has the ability to regenerate. If an axon is damaged anywhere in the peripheral nervous system, you can regenerate depending upon the Schwann cells or the myelin sheath that's around there. If you still have good myelin sheathing, you can still regenerate the nerve. So here's how it happens. Basically, if an axon becomes fragmented, it's going to be broken down. And you can see that we still have the Schwann cells on the outside here. Here's a really good intact Schwann cell with its axon. And over here we have a broken axon. You can see it's fragmented into pieces. and the Schwann cells are broken, but they're still there. This would be, of course, the endoneurium, or the connective tissue sheathing on the outside of each one. Once that fragmentation has occurred, we do still have to have some cleaning crew come in. So these macrophages come through and they clean out the broken pieces. They destroy any unwanted or integrated structures that have been destroyed. And after we've got the area cleaned up, what we'll notice is that the axon actually will start sprouting new pieces. And when the axon filaments start sprouting, they'll move through the Schwann cells that were kind of holding the grounds there. And they're going to reach out and they're going to connect up with the other end. Once they do reconnect, they will form back together and it will regenerate that axon itself. Notice also that the myelin sheath has started to solidify itself and it will start wrapping just like this one was over here. If you remember back to chapter 11, we said it creates a jelly roll fashion and it will continue to do that. So that's a quick example of how our nerves can regenerate. Remember, the nerves themselves, the neuron themselves, the actual cell body is amitotic, and so you can't regenerate or create a new one, but the axon will be able to regenerate. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit and just talk a little bit about spinal nerves. I said that we'd talk more about cranial nerves a little bit later on, and we will see those. So I just want to introduce to you spinal nerves. Spinal nerves, you can see there's 31 pairs of mixed nerves, and if you look at them, the numbers look very similar to something we've already learned, with one small exception. Notice that there's 8 cervical spinal nerves, yet if you remember back to the bone section, there was only 7 cervical vertebrae. Everything else looks pretty similar. 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal area. There is a reason. There's only 7 cervical vertebrae, but 8 cervical spinal nerves, because 7 exit the vertebrae superior to the vertebrae for which they're named, and 1 exits inferior to the last vertebrae in the cervical section, or the 7th. So if you count that up, of course, 7 above and 1 below, that's going to be 8 cervical spinal nerves. The rest of them are all named for the nerve which they go inferior to. So each one of these, so if you kind of look at it this way, every single one of our spinal nerves is named for the nerve that, or named for the vertebrae that's above it, except for the very first set. So here they are: cervical nerves, C1 through 8, thoracic nerves, T1 through 12, lumbar, sacral, and then coccygeal down here at the bottom. Instead of learning the names of each one of these like we're going to have to do with the cranial nerves, I just want you to learn a plexus. And so what we're going to do is we're going to spend more time looking at these plexuses over here, because this will kind of give us a general idea of where information is being sent to or getting information from, and it helps us to pinpoint where on this cervical nerves information is coming from. So here's a cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, there's a lumbar enlargement down to the plexus, and then a sacral plexus. Notice that we kind of skipped over this whole thoracic region. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Our spinal nerves are set up to input or to receive information from our central nervous system. The way that they do that is through something called roots. Each spinal nerve has 2 roots. There's going to be a ventral root and a dorsal root. The ventral root is always going to be the motor information. So this is any information that's going in efferent pathway. It's away from the central nervous system. That is your ventral root. The dorsal roots always have the sensory information. This is always going to be information going towards the brain. So we have a dorsal root and a ventral root, 2 pathways. Dorsal, afferent, towards the brain. Ventral, efferent, away from the brain. There are rami, which are tiny little spinal nerve structures that move through also, and each branch is broken down into different ones. There's a dorsal and a ventral, of course, the anterior, the posterior, and then there's a meningeal, and then a communicans also, and you can see exactly what those are. All the ventral rami except for the thoracic have these interlacing networks called plexuses, and that's what I want to get into next, is the cervical, the brachial, the lumbar, and the sacral plexus. A plexus basically is where fibers are going to crisscross and they're going to branch and then they're going to integrate and send information into one specific area. Now what's neat about these is because of this branching and because there's multiple plexuses going different areas, if you damage one piece of it, it doesn't cause paralysis. So let's look first at the cervical plexus. You can see the cervical plexus is the ventral rami C1 through C4, and it goes to most areas of the cutaneous nerves, the neck, the ears, the back of the head, the shoulders, and innervating the muscles of the neck. The major nerve that we have here is called the phrenic nerve, and the phrenic nerve, of course, is the only one that kind of reaches out of that area because it goes down into the diaphragm, and the phrenic nerve is going to control what happens with the diaphragm. Anytime we irritate the phrenic nerve, that's when you would develop something called hiccups, and all of us have experienced that sensation. Here's what it looks like. And here's this phrenic nerve. You can see the one that's going down into the body. The brachial plexus. Brachial plexus is, of course, going to the arms, giving rise to the innervation of the upper limbs, C5 through C8 and T1. Notice that it does have major branching. There's roots and trunks and divisions. Let me show you what those look like. Over here in blue, we have the roots. This is what's coming directly off of our spinal nerves. Then if you'll notice that they come down and they turn into these three different trunks. The three trunks are then going to split into two divisions. There's an anterior division and a posterior division. Now notice that they branch and they go in different directions and they're all connection. That's a really good thing. Remember, if we damage one, we don't have paralysis to the entire group. But these three trunks turn into two divisions, and even though there's still three pieces of it, it's two divisions. There's going to be an anterior in yellow and a posterior in green. This anterior, of course, is going to the front side of the arm, the posterior going to the back side of the arm. There are a couple of major nerves that you should know that are in this brachial plexus, and those are these here: axillary, musculocutaneous, median, ulnar, and radial. I'll let you read about those. This is a beautiful cadaver photo that was in your textbook. I decided to put it in here because I thought it was really useful. If you look, you can see the actual cords coming down out of the shoulder region that split into trunks and then, of course, into divisions. Really neat to see that actually in our bodies. Lumbar plexus innervates the thighs. This is going to be the anterior aspects of our legs. Notice I said the anterior aspect of the legs, the lumbar, L1 through L4. The two major nerves in here are the femoral nerve and the obturator. If you think about this, the femoral nerve, of course, is going to be working with the femur. Obturator going through that giant hole in the os coxae bones. You can see the anterior aspect of the leg here with the lumbar plexus. The next one is the sacral plexus, and the sacral plexus is going to innervate the posterior aspect of the leg. You can see serving the buttocks, the lower limb, the pelvic structures, and the perineum. The biggest one, of course, is the sciatic nerve. Some of you have probably had some issues with your sciatics in the past. Very common for pregnant women to have issues with sciatic nerve. But you'll notice it is the biggest, it is the longest, it is the thickest nerve in the entire body. It is just a huge nerve that gets irritated sometimes and can cause problems walking. You can see how long this nerve is. It actually turns into the tibial and the fibular nerve as well once it gets down into the lower portion of our leg. So here's the cadaver photo. You can see how thick that sciatic nerve is. Just a really beautiful image. This, of course, what you're looking at here is going to be the epineurium. Good, epineurium.